beautiful. What is that? A sequel? Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2021 comedy sequel, Coming to America. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. Coming to America stars Eddie Murphy, Jermaine Fowler, and Arsenio Hall, and was directed by Craig Brewer. 30 years after his trip to America, Prince Akeem, played by Eddie Murphy, learns that he has a son in Queens and seeks him out in hopes that he will one day be the heir to the Zamundan throne. I think context is important, and understanding how somebody approaches a movie can be really helpful for providing context to their thoughts on that movie. So I want to preface this review by saying that I absolutely love the original 1988 Coming to America. It's in my top 3 all-time favorite movies and has provided me with decades of entertainment. So, the prospect of getting a sequel 33 years after the original film came out left me a bit torn. On one hand, I was beyond excited to see these characters again and get a new story with them. But on the other hand, I was definitely skeptical of the excessive time gap and whether they could craft a new story that was a worthy follow-up to the original. So I went into this movie as a hopeful fan, but tried to keep my expectations low, knowing full well that it was never going to be as good as the original, and also that most of my enjoyment was likely going to stem from nostalgia. Well, it turns out that I have judged correctly. Coming to America is truly a movie for fans of the original. Like many other very belated sequels, this is a nostalgia fest. Whether we're talking about the story beats, the characters, or even the jokes, this movie is constantly presenting us with references and callbacks to the original movie. And as a Coming to America superfan, I was absolutely giddy from all of the nostalgia. There were some big obvious callbacks that you'd expect, like some McDowell's fun for example, but I have to say, I was surprised by 2 things. One, there were a few very iconic aspects of the original, like things everybody associates with the film that surprisingly weren't referenced. I'm not going to say what they were here, but it'll shine through to fans of the original when they watch. The second surprising thing about the nostalgia aspect is a positive one, and it's just how many little tiny things from the original get incorporated here. Obscure lines of dialogue, musical cues, characters who got seconds of screen time, a certain pachyderm whose brief appearance has always been one of my favorite random moments in the original. As I was watching, I was honestly a bit shocked by how many of my favorite obscure things from the first film were referenced here. So this was an absolute joy to watch as a fan of the original, if only for the nostalgia. And even though this is clearly aimed at existing fans, I do think this movie is completely understandable to somebody who's never seen that first film. It likely won't be nearly as enjoyable without the nostalgia, and you might have a few moments of confusion regarding some of the references, but the story itself is easy enough to follow, especially with the way they remind us of the key plot points of the original. Speaking of the story, it was okay. It was definitely an unnecessary continuation and rehashed a number of things from the first movie, but I do think it had some merit. It kind of gets into the cyclical nature of things with a like-father, like-son thread that plays out on 2 levels, Akeem and Lavelle, but also Jaffe and Akeem. So while the plot is nowhere near as strong as what we had with the original movie, and plays out exactly how you probably expected it would, it's still an okay story. Nothing particularly unique, but with a movie that relies so heavily on its nostalgia, that's kind of a moot point. One of the greatest things about the first film was its set of entertaining and extremely memorable characters. They were funny, and some were certainly more like caricatures than others, but from Akeem and Semi down to the smallest roles, these characters felt important to the movie, and they felt like real people with real relationships. This sequel, unfortunately, falters a bit with its characters. Part of it's due to the writing, but I think it's also partly due to the extremely big cast. This movie incorporates a ton of returning characters, but it also introduces a ton of new characters. So it's just overloaded. They don't spend enough time focusing on beloved fan favorites, but they also don't spend enough time properly establishing most of the new characters. The returning cast was a delight to see. There were a few exceptions, but most of the main characters are back, and a surprising number of the small characters are back too. We do get quite a bit of time with Akeem, and while Eddie Murphy's performance feels a bit more forced this time around, he's still quite entertaining. I will say though, that most of the other returning characters have very reduced roles. Semi and Lisa honestly don't have all that much to do here, and while they both have their good moments, they're definitely secondary characters. And just about everybody else has been reduced to being tertiary characters, including Cleo McDowell, who has a remarkably small role to play in this movie, which I think is one of the biggest travesties of the film. As far as the new characters go, it's a bit of a mixed bag, leaning towards a disappointing bag. For me, there were only a few positive additions. On the Zamundan side, we had Akeem and Lisa's 3 daughters, who were all really good. The oldest daughter, Mika, was definitely the standout, and her subplot and role in the larger plot was one of the better elements of the story. Mirembe, one of the royal groomers, was also a pleasant surprise of a character. On the Queen side, the only new character who felt worthwhile was Lavelle. He's this odd mix of likable and unlikable, but he does have the most significant story arc, and I would argue that he's probably the main character of this movie, perhaps even over Akeem. The rest of the new characters, Lavelle's family in Queens and General Izzy, really don't add much. Their humor feels at odds with the rest of the comedy, and the story could have played out just about the same without them, or at the very least, without them having such large roles. Aside from perhaps introducing people to the masterpiece that is the 1988 Coming to America, Coming to America isn't gonna create any new fans. Nobody who watched the first movie and said, no thank you, is gonna be like, yeah, about this one. The average person is gonna just view this as an average movie, no different from dozens of other comedies per year. People with some Coming to America experience are probably gonna fall into one of two camps. You'll either feel like Clarence watching a Randy Watson performance, or you're going to be very happy to be there and jump up yelling, yes, yes, into face. I was lucky enough to have that latter response, and the fun callbacks made for an entertainingly nostalgic experience. Was it better than the first movie? Of course not. But would I give up a chance to see some of my favorite characters again? Nah. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The biggest pro has gotta be all the callbacks to the first film. Call it fan service, call it references and nods, call it whatever you want, but nostalgia is a very powerful thing. And as a big fan of the original movie, I absolutely loved all of the callbacks here. Repeated lines, slightly modified variants on some of the gags, unexpected character appearances, seeing how these characters and locations changed after 30-something years, or didn't change in some instances, was a joy. And I had this near constant giddiness throughout the whole movie. You could argue that this film relies too heavily on nostalgia for the first movie, but that doesn't change the fact that this was one of the best aspects. Oh yeah, and Coming to America fans, make sure you stay until the very end of the credits for a nice little post-credit scene. Pro number 2 is something that I didn't really anticipate, but it's the set design and costumes. Unlike the first film, the majority of this one is set in Zamunda, and so while we do get moments of the more realistic, lived-in feel of Queens, this movie focuses on the opulence of the Zamundan palace. So everything feels more like a set, but it's visually rich and interesting as we explore spaces we never got to see in that first movie. And speaking of that first film, the Zamundan wardrobe here is just as intricate as ever. And since we spend so much more time in Zamunda, we get to see a whole lot more of it. On the con side, I have 2 issues that are closely related. The first is the reduction of most of the returning roles. I think it's amazing that they got so many people back again, and while there are some that I would have loved to have seen at least a cameo from, I can't really complain too much. What I can complain about, though, is the underutilization of many of the characters they did bring back, most frustratingly, Cleo McDowell. The first movie had a ton of characters too, but it felt very balanced and never overloaded. Here, they struggled to find that balance and weren't able to recapture the same character dynamic magic of the original. The second character con concerns many of the new characters. Some were good, Mika, Mirembe, Lavelle to an extent, but the vast majority felt unnecessary to the story and really stuck out like sore thumbs. General Izzy was a bizarre character, and while he had a humorous connection to the first film and served as the major source of conflict in this one, he felt like a character who was made for a different movie and just dropped into this one. Similarly, Lavelle's family in Queens didn't seem to serve much of a purpose other than to play out a few comedy of manners gags. They had a stray moment here and there, but felt like they were out of sync with the comedy and tone of the rest of the film. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying any of the films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Coming to America 3.5 out of 5 paws. As a huge fan of the first movie, the callbacks and other nostalgia-based references managed to make this an incredibly enjoyable experience in spite of the story and character issues. I fully realize my rating's a bit inflated as a result, but for somebody with no nostalgia connection to the first movie, I would still suspect it'd be somewhere around 3 paws for most people. I would recommend Coming to America to fans of the original Coming to America. That might sound obvious, considering this is a sequel, but it's an even more apt recommendation than it'd normally be, because this movie was clearly designed for existing fans. That's not to say that newcomers won't be able to follow along or will hate it, but having at least a certain level of nostalgia will be a big help, as will knowing the original film well enough to be able to pick up on and appreciate all the callbacks and references here. If you liked Coming to America, I would obviously recommend the original 1988 Coming to America. Seriously, if you enjoyed this movie and you've never seen the first film or haven't seen it in a long time, you need to watch it. Like, right now. I'll wait. If you want another comedy about a normal person discovering that they're actually royalty, you might want to watch The Princess Diaries. It's definitely got a different style to its humor, but there are similarities with the premise, as well as its royal family traditions theme. And if you want another comedy with a suddenly royalty theme, you should check out Disney's Aladdin. Preferably the animated one, though the live-action remake works too. In addition to Aladdin's storyline of trying to pass for royalty, there are also surprising similarities between Jasmine's subplot in Aladdin and Mika's subplot here. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Coming to America? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what movie features your favorite fictional country? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.